This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
Third speaker, potentially, so are we still missing Casper Rasmussen? Or yes, okay. I was hopeful that he might have slipped in, but no. Okay, so this may be potentially the last speaker, but we have a paper. We go from Yugoslavia to France, and Sean McLaughlin is going of the University of Wisconsin. He's going to talk about France in John F. Kennedy's world, a topic which will prove, I suspect, very interesting. So over to you.
So I ask you to bear with me.
Okay. That looks incorrect.
All right. Okay, good morning everyone. Thank you for coming out to our panel. I'd like to thank the organizers for all their efforts bringing us all here today. As I look through the list of people who are speaking today, I'm incredibly impressed, and I just feel grateful that I've been given the opportunity to come here and be with you all. All right, so the purpose of the paper I'm going to be presenting today is to examine where France fit into John F. Kennedy's worldview. Simply put, I'd like to talk about what he thought about France and why, and more importantly, what the implications of these views were on his foreign policy in general. My interest in this subject matter relates to a manuscript I'm revising right now about the failure of French attempts to dissuade Kennedy from opting for a military solution in South Vietnam rather than a diplomatic one. As we all know, the Kennedy administration pushed the United States closer and closer towards direct military intervention in the Civil War in South Vietnam. This was, in all fairness, a mess that he inherited from the Eisenhower administration, and yes, I will acknowledge that he died before the final decision on what to do in South Vietnam had to be taken. What I would like to speak about briefly is that as soon as Kennedy arrived in the White House, the French started a pretty sustained lobbying effort. De Gaulle met face-to-face with Kennedy in Paris at the end of May 1961. He said that he thought it was a terrible idea to invest millions of dollars in military aid and training to the South Vietnamese. He felt that this was a corrupt government. It had no legitimacy in the eyes of its people. Every one of de Gaulle's lieutenants in every meeting with their American counterparts for the next 2.5 years, they stuck to this line. They were exceedingly polite. They tried not to offend their American friends, but they did feel that this was a point of view that the Kennedy administration was not taking into account. Now, given time constraints, I'm not going to go into this in any greater detail, but suffice it to say, in my estimation, the French were giving what was proven in hindsight to be correct advice on South Vietnam. They were very polite in their lobbying efforts, and I think what's really important here is that the French really went out of their way to keep their disagreement with the Kennedy administration out of the press. They did not want to undermine Kennedy in the eyes of the world. Now, there's a terrible tragedy that takes place, and not just one for Vietnam, but also for the United States, because Kennedy is close to this French advice on the Civil War there. But I don't really think that this matters. The idea that, well, France and the United States were of differing opinions, I don't think that this really matters all that much. What's really important that I'd like to talk about today is that Kennedy seemed offended, just simply not by what the French were saying, but the idea that a Frenchman would challenge him on a foreign policy question. Kennedy considered this his sphere of expertise. So when I was doing my research in Boston, I really wanted to look backwards. And what I set out to do was to try and find evidence of whether or not Kennedy had picked up anti-French views, and where did they come from, and how did they influence his dealings with de Gaulle, and more specifically his handling of the Now, I think the evidence shows quite clearly that Kennedy didn't like France, and he didn't like France basically from the moment that he started to, as a young man, form a view of the world. Now, in my paper, I used the word Francophobia. I talked about John F. Kennedy. I don't know that this is necessarily the most appropriate term. However, I think the record shows that for 25 years before he became president, in almost all of his private writings on France, Kennedy is overwhelmingly negative. When he became an elected official in 1946, almost everything he has to say about the French in public is also critical and negative. So let's talk about what it was that France did to put itself in such a bad place in Kennedy's view of the world. Okay. A couple of quick points I'd like to make. Americans have taken their views of France from English colonists who arrived in the New World in the 17th century. And in a lot of respects, these views haven't evolved. I don't think it's particularly surprising that Kennedy didn't like France very much. Most Americans didn't like France back then. Most Americans still don't like France. Second point of a general nature that I like to make is that I believe that Anglophilia and Francophobia, or the inverse, are two sides of the same coin. I mean, this is just simple logic. You can't go for the Yankees and the Red Sox at the same time. So Kennedy likes England, and I think as a result of the fact that he likes England, he doesn't like France all that much. Okay, let's turn the clock back. At the end of the 19th century, there's this huge upsurge in Anglo-Saxonism in the United States. This is a period, would have been Kennedy's parents' generation. So why this upsurge in Anglo-Saxonism at this particular time? Well, England got a whole lot more likable in the eyes of many Americans because it stopped opposing American territorial expansion. London was willing to cut deals on the Oregon Territory, sold Canada out over the Alaska boundary dispute, didn't get involved in the American Civil War, and generally looked favorably on American predominance in the Americas and keeping England's rivals out of that particular region. When social Darwinism takes root, many Americans start to take pride in the success of the British Empire. For them, they believe that if there are some innate racial characteristics that have made the British so great at colonizing the world, then Americans would have inherited these at some point down the road. So if England is great, America is great too, by extension. Anglo-Saxonists of the late 19th century, they believed that Latin peoples, such as the French, they had their day, and the accomplishments that they had racked up weren't nearly as impressive as those of the Anglo-Saxon peoples in any event. Well, you don't have Americans in the 20th century who are walking around calling themselves Anglo-Saxonists, but these views, this view of the world, the United States and Britain are, the two top dogs. This is surprisingly enduring. Michael Hunt writes about this in Ideology in U.S. Foreign Policy. In these views, this celebration of British imperialism and Britain's role as a world power and America following in its footsteps, this would have been prevalent in an environment such as Choate, like an elite boarding school on the East Coast that Kennedy attended as a young man. Okay, so by the time, I don't know how you guys feel about this, but when I look back at Kennedy, I think, he probably starts forming his views about the world when he's 13, 14, 15 years old. If we all think back to our own lives, I think this is the same moment we started thinking about this stuff. So I guess it's useful to establish a timeline. Kennedy's born in 1917, so by the time he reaches adolescence, we're in the 1930s. And at this point, the warm feelings that most Americans had towards France during the era of the Great War had long since dissipated. After the Treaty of Versailles, most Americans view France as a vindictive bully that had mistreated Weimar Germany, send troops into the Ruhr, that wouldn't allow the Germans reasonable modification to the Treaty of Versailles. Also, many Americans are very bitter at the French and their unwillingness to pay their First World War era debts in full. Americans believe that business contracts are sacrosanct, and the French do not honor them the same way that Anglo-Saxons do. So, at this point, Kennedy's a young man. There's a general anti-French sentiment that's circulating in the United States. But independently of that, Kennedy is becoming a very ardent Anglophile. And one of the reasons for this is that we all know that he's very sickly as a young man, has a lot of downtime in the hospital, and when he's 15 years old, he gets his hands on a copy of Winston Churchill's book about the First World War, The World Crisis. And it's at this moment at age 15, and this is well before the Second World War, when Winston Churchill puts himself as the greatest leader this country's ever seen. Kennedy, he's idolizing Winston Churchill. Also, significantly, in 1937, John F. Kennedy's father, Joseph Kennedy Sr., was named ambassador to London. And this is kind of a patronage appointment that's payback for his support of FDR's first two presidential campaigns. So when John F. Kennedy is 20 years old, he's an undergraduate at Harvard. His dad gets this hugely important diplomatic posting, and there's an opportunity for the family to spend summers over in England and to hobnob with British elites. Now, we might assume that, as Boston Irish, that the Kennedy clan might have been instinctively Anglophobic. This is definitely not the case. And what the Kennedys found in London was that there was an opportunity here to move beyond this Irish tag. There's some irony in that it was in England that the Kennedys were first accepted as Americans. And Joseph Kennedy, I mean, this is a guy whose father, his father-in-law, they would have aspired to being ward bosses in Boston. But Joseph Kennedy was a very rich man. He had this great diplomatic posting, and he had this huge suite at Windsor Castle. He had phone numbers for all these important British nobles. He was incredibly proud of what he had accomplished. So the Kennedys fit in England quite well. John F. Kennedy, his sister Kathleen, they're running around with notable young Brits. And there's kind of a love affair between the Kennedys and England, and at least at first, England and the Kennedys. Okay, I have not really spoken about France to this point. Okay, so we see here that John F. Kennedy was quite fond of England as a young man, so where does France fit into all of this? Okay, in the Kennedy Library there's a copy of a diary that John F. Kennedy kept from the summer of 1937. He's 20 years old at this point. He's on his summer break from Harvard, and he set out on a 3-week tour of the continent. Started out in France, and then went on to Italy, and finished up in Germany. Now, Christopher Endy has written about the impact of tourism on American foreign policy in this period. And Christopher Endy believes that you've got thousands of middle-class, upper-class American tourists who go back to the old world, and they encounter this romanticized notion of what life could be, a society that's not hyper-modern like the United States. And these American tourists, they usually come home and they keep this great fondness for the countries that they've visited close to their hearts. For Kennedy, when he goes to France, he has completely the opposite reaction. And what he does in his diary, he begins complaining incessantly almost from the moment he sets foot in France, and the observations that he notes in his diary, I think, are quite telling. Now, first off, this is his laundry list of complaints about the French. First off, he says that Americans, they've opted to support these progressive, unifying New Deal reforms of the Roosevelt administration. But the French, they buy into all these radical solutions. They voted for Léon Blum and the Popular Front, and this was only going to end in tears. They didn't realize what they were signing up for. Kennedy looks at individual French as crooks with appalling hygiene. They've got terrible cabbage breath. They never bathe. He says they revel in cruel blood sports like bullfighting. When I read this, I just thought, France and bullfighting do not seem to go hand in hand, but Kennedy has made this association between the two. Kennedy complains that French tourist sites are artificial, they're overcrowded. He seems to be the only American tourist that's not having a good time. And he feels that the French, generally, when you get outside of Paris, they're very conservative, they're very backward, and he kind of thumbs his nose at this country that aspires to a high civilization. Now, I don't want to be glib here, but Kennedy is traveling with one of his closest friends, Lemoyne Billings, who's a closeted homosexual and presumably did not share Kennedy's enthusiasm for chasing girls on his summer holidays. Now, Kennedy also, one of the things he's quite disappointed to learn is that when you're in France, when you're in parts of the country outside Paris, custom is that a young lady does not go out with a young man unescorted until she's 21 or over. So the position I'm going to make in my book is that Kennedy makes all these sweeping generalizations about France, the French, from the moment he sets foot in the country. For me, this means that he already had his mind largely made up before he ever met a French person. And then during his time in France, there are no sexual conquests, and I think that this serves to cement his anti-French views. Just a couple of quick quotes from this diary, which is a really great document. The 1st of August, he crosses over into Italy. He wanted to get a parting shot in against the French. This is what he says in the diary, quote, went to the beach, saw our first good-looking foreign girls. The Italian streets are much more full and lively than those of France, and the whole race seems more attractive. Fascism seems to treat them well. Okay, it gets better. At the tail end of his voyage, Kennedy, he heads up the Rhine through Germany. There's a story I don't have time to tell about how he stole a beer glass at the encouragement of an SS officer who spoke Oxford English and then ended up getting arrested by a doorman. Anyway. Okay, so this is what Kennedy has to say as a 20-year-old about Germany. Quote, very beautiful as there are many castles all along the way. All the towns are very attractive, showing that the Nordic races certainly seem superior to the Latins. The Germans really are too good. It makes people gang up against them for protection. End quote. Okay, so it doesn't end here. There are more writings. There's stuff, Kennedy keeps notes on books he's reading. You'll find preparation he makes for speeches, other stuff, doodles that are indicative of the way he feels about France as a public official after he enters the Congress in 1946. Okay, well, immediately after the Second World War comes to an end, Kennedy goes back to France for a second time. He kept another diary. This is published, it's called Prelude to Leadership, edited by Hugh Sidney. And we see in this diary that Kennedy now has more mature views, but the way he sees France hasn't really changed. So in Prelude to Leadership, Kennedy is writing about all the problems that European leaders are going to be facing, getting their economies back on track, resisting communism, so on and so forth. But when Kennedy writes about France in 1945, he talks about France as a decadent exporter of luxury goods. He talks about how much difficulty brandy exporters are going to have rebuilding their markets, and perfume manufacturers, and so on. So he's choosing to look at elements of France that would feminize the country and the extension of this, make it an irrational actor in world affairs. There's no mention in this diary about more traditionally masculine economic pursuits that I associate France with, such as agriculture, the auto industry, mining, banking, and so on and so forth. Kennedy really doesn't have anything to say about how France made a remarkable rally late in the Second World War, ended up at the victor's table. Nothing to say about de Gaulle, how he, with long odds, managed to restore some semblance of order and purpose to a very chaotic and divided country that had just suffered its most humiliating national defeat. In other addresses, Kennedy, Zlatko mentioned Yugoslavia in 1951. Well, Kennedy goes to Europe again in the early 1950s. He's touring countries that are outside the Soviet bloc or American aligned. And he's got all sorts of wonderful things to say about the will to resist, as he calls it, of countries like West Germany, Yugoslavia. But he says that it's France that really seems to give him pause. He finds it the most worrying country in Europe. And now, what is a will to resist? This is completely intangible, it's subjective, and I don't think there's any accurate way of measuring it. Now, when Kennedy is writing about West Germany, he feels it's entirely legitimate for the West Germans to want to rearm and gain some autonomy, but the French are an obstacle. He doesn't seem to have any sympathy for the French. Perhaps there are fears of a rearmed Germany. He doesn't seem to understand that this is a country that's been attacked twice by Germany in the span of 25 years. So I think this lack of empathy for France is very, very telling at this point. Very quickly, during the 1950s, from the Senate, Kennedy, his most biting public commentary is directed towards the French. He believes that they're ham-fisted in their colonial rule, that they're driving peoples of the nascent third world into the arms of the communists. He doesn't single out the Belgians, he doesn't single out any other European colonial powers the way he does the French. He's got a lot to say about Indochina, he's got a lot to say about Algeria. None of it is particularly positive. And there's a great irony that when the British are fighting communist insurgents in Malaya, Kennedy believes that they're doing a service to the world. When the French are fighting communists in Vietnam, they're being irrational. They're trying to preserve colonial rule. This is just evidence to him of some flaw to their national character. Just bring it to a close. Kennedy briefly tried to engage de Gaulle in a dialogue on world affairs in 1961. He's intrigued by this idea of de Gaulle being different than politicians of post-war France. This is the guy who's physically imposing. He's a genuine war hero. He'd taken these steps to draw the war in Algeria to a close. But this dialogue that Kennedy initiates with de Gaulle, it doesn't last more than a single letter. And when Kennedy discovers that de Gaulle is not going to affirm his foreign policy plans, he's not going to give him a pat on the back and say, yes, you're doing a great job, I totally agree with you, he decides to just shut down the conversation entirely. By 1962, Kennedy, he admits to State Department officials, he's just given up on France. He doesn't even want to talk to them. Benjamin Bradley, a journalist, says that Kennedy calls de Gaulle a bastard. Well, de Gaulle might have been a bastard, but he didn't do anything to Kennedy to warrant this label. And I think the rapidity with which Kennedy gave up on France shows that when he came to the White House in 1961, he already had his mind made up on this country, and he had decided that this was going to be an antagonistic, unproductive relationship.
Okay, thank you very much.